C'est parti pour le film. Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue à l'Abbaye aux Dames pour la plénière de clôture de la 2e édition du Forum mondial Normandie pour la paix. Bâtir la paix, c'est un challenge de chaque instant. Cet après-midi, nous allons mettre un coup de projecteur spécial sur le rôle de l'Union européenne face à ce défi. Nous allons notamment découvrir l'indice Normandie du Parlement européen. Mais tout d'abord, cher François-Xavier, pouvez-vous nous dire quelques mots concernant les liens particuliers qui se tissent entre la Normandie et l'Europe ?
En effet, Frédéric, on ne peut pas envisager Normandie pour la paix sans une dimension européenne très forte. D'abord parce que la libération de l'Europe occidentale, elle s'est faite ici même et nous célébrerons demain le 75e anniversaire de la libération, du débarquement et de la bataille de Normandie. Et que notre région, la région Normandie, région monde, elle inspire la paix et la liberté, que l'Europe, le projet européen, c'est un projet de liberté. Vous l'avez vu sur ce film, sera inauguré dans quelques jours un bâtiment spectaculaire au mémorial de Caen, avec l'histoire du continent européen à travers un film, une expérience immersive à 360 degrés. L'Europe, elle fait partie des gènes de la Normandie. Et depuis maintenant 2 ans, entre Normandie pour la paix, la région Normandie et le Parlement européen, des liens très forts se sont noués avec la publication chaque année d'une étude sur la contribution des grandes politiques européennes à la paix dans le monde. Pas seulement la politique de défense, mais les politiques d'aide au développement, la politique agricole, la politique commerciale qui contribuent à la stabilité du monde. L'année dernière, dans l'étude, il y a un focus très intéressant sur le Kosovo. Cette année, le focus de cette étude, qui est disponible en ligne, mais aussi dans la librairie éphémère qui est dans le village, c'est la Colombie. Peu de gens dans l'opinion publique savent quel est le rôle essentiel que l'Union européenne a joué dans le processus de paix en Colombie. Et vous avez là une étude extrêmement riche, très intéressante, qui relate les efforts incessants déployés par l'Europe sur la Colombie. Et de cette convention qui comporte aussi un volet éducatif très important avec des jeunes Normands qui vont visiter les institutions européennes, visiter la maison de l'histoire de l'Europe, avec un certain nombre d'actions qui montrent cette dimension européenne très forte. Eh bien, nous sommes heureux, depuis cette année, que Normandie pour la paix soit aussi sous le patronage du président du Parlement européen, M. Tajani. Et je voudrais vraiment remercier le Parlement européen pour son implication très forte dans l'ambition Normandie pour la paix.
Tout cela... Ça mérite des applaudissements, en effet. Tout cela est vraiment enthousiasmant. Et maintenant, j'imagine que vous êtes tous impatients de découvrir l'indice Normandie du Parlement européen.
Et pour cela, nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir Monsieur le vice-président du Parlement européen. Je demande à Monsieur Ioan Mircea Pașcu de nous rejoindre et vous pouvez l'applaudir chaleureusement. Monsieur Ioan Mircea Pașcu, vice-président du Parlement européen. Merci d'avoir accepté notre invitation.
Pour participer à la présentation de l'indice Normandie du Parlement européen, j'invite à nous rejoindre le fondateur et directeur exécutif de l'Institute for Economics and Peace, M. Steve Kilelea, ainsi que le directeur du service de recherche du Parlement européen, M. Étienne Bassot.
Vous avez, Monsieur Bassot, la scène pour vous.
Bonjour à tous et bienvenue pour cette session. C'est un plaisir de se retrouver ici pour la présentation de cet indice Normandie tant attendu qui a été un gros travail au cours des derniers mois. Donc j'ai le plaisir d'introduire le vice-président du Parlement européen, M. Mircea Pascu, qui représente ici le président Antonio Tajani. Et je dirais que, sans m'avancer trop comme fonctionnaire, puisque ce n'est pas notre rôle, que parmi les vice-présidents du Parlement européen, vous êtes sans doute un de ceux qui est le mieux placé pour présenter cet indice. Et ceci, je dirais, à 3 titres. Merci. Tout d'abord parce que l'indice, c'est un travail de recherche et que vous êtes vice-président, professeur de sciences politiques, vous avez enseigné en Roumanie, vous avez aussi enseigné dans d'autres pays, notamment au Japon. Et puis, ensuite, parce que vous avez été vous-même engagé sur les questions de paix et sécurité. Vous avez été ministre de la Défense en Roumanie, et pas un ministre de gestion des affaires courantes, un ministre qui a permis une mutation importante, et vous avez été un artisan de l'entrée de la Roumanie dans l'OTAN, un moment très important dans l'histoire de votre pays. Et puis enfin, parce que vous êtes engagé depuis l'année de l'adhésion de la Roumanie au Parlement européen. Vous avez été membre de manière discontinue depuis l'adhésion de votre pays au Parlement européen. Et au Parlement européen, vous avez été, avant d'être vice-président du Parlement de l'institution, vous avez été vice-président de la Commission des Affaires étrangères. Donc c'est un plaisir pour nous de vous inviter à prendre la parole pour donner la ligne politique et présenter ce travail de l'indice de Normandie. Merci.
Monsieur le Président de la région Normandie, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, chers amis. Au nom d'Antonio Tajani, président du Parlement européen, je voudrais vous remercier pour cette invitation au second Forum mondial de la paix. Par sa présence, le Parlement européen montre en effet qu'il n'y a pas de paix durable sans l'engagement direct des citoyens et de leurs représentants à l'échelle de notre continent. La paix marche main dans la main avec la démocratie. The very idea of an ever closer union between European states was founded on the values of peace, reconciliation, democracy, human rights, and freedom. The 2012 Nobel Prize was awarded to the European Union for, and I quote, the stabilizing role of the EU which has been played in transforming most of Europe from a continent of war to a continent of peace, end of quote. Peace is a good very few appreciate when they have it, and many more miss it when they don't have it. As Alexis de Tocqueville, a famous philosopher from Normandie, wrote in his Démocratie en Amérique, peace defined only as a public order is not enough for democracy to survive. Both in academia and in the mostly brutal real world of international security, until not so long time ago, peace was mainly defined as the absence of war. Therefore, a military victory would mean automatically peace. It would mean mission accomplished. After the end of the Cold War, academics started to make a distinction between negative peace, meaning the absence of war, and positive peace, which include long-term factors. Most academics and policymakers argue that it is an illusion that one can make peace only with military means. Peace needs to be defined as more than the simple absence of war and of international and intranational violence or as a sentiment of individual security. The positive definition includes elements of well-being, of a more equal global society, the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, a sustainable and healthy environment, protection from forced displacement or from cyber attacks. Peace is also found in the knowledge that one is protected by structures adequate to prevent a potential nuclear war, structures embodied in institutions which regulate disarmament and contain the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. While stressing the importance of positive peace, I have to remind that it is not possible to achieve it without security and defense. We cannot have positive peace without ending wars and, most importantly, without the tools to deter and prevent them. Negative peace, therefore, is necessary and positive, and it is not to be taken for granted. It is very good that we focus on positive peace and the long-term factors, but defense and security are also necessary preconditions for lasting peace. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU is internally an embodiment of the enriched definition of positive peace. Peace also lies at the center of EU's foreign policy and action in the world. The Treaty of Lisbon makes it clear that the contribution to peace is the primary objective of EU's relations with the wider world, alongside security, sustainable development, and the protection of human rights. Europe has witnessed a period of prolonged peace and security, but quite close to us, our neighbors and the neighbors of our neighbors are suffering the dramatic consequences of war and conflict. Think only of the Western Balkans in the 90s and Ukraine in our present time. Today, almost all countries in the European neighborhood are at risk in one way or another. In the east, several countries face territorial occupations. In the south, violent conflict is raging in Syria and Libya, with severe consequences for neighboring countries. The EU is contributing to peace as much as possible through emergency humanitarian aid, but also through structural assistance to reconstruction and support to foster reconciliation and through peacekeeping missions. In more distant places like sub-Saharan Africa or in Colombia, we have used civilian tools or partnered with the regional entities to support peace processes and stability. The studies produced by our European Parliamentary Research Service for this forum include ample evidence and details on the achievements of the European Project for Peace in Europe and the EU's actions in the current world. My goal today is to introduce the in-depth analysis and case studies of the European Parliament and highlight several matters that I consider particularly relevant. I consider that the findings of the studies can contribute to the debates of the remarkable laboratory of peace, that is the Normandie Peace Forum. I want to welcome and introduce the Normandie Index, an ambitious and constructive idea which emerged from the European Parliament's partnership with the region of Normandy. The idea was implemented by the Institute of Economics and Peace and the EPRS. In essence, the index has two main goals. First, the Normandie Index aims to provide a coherent picture of the world, of the security environment based on a rigorous scientific methodology. I am positive Mr. Kilili will expand on the methodology and the scientific aspects of the index. The Normandie Index is different from other indices that have the same goal, like the ones produced by the UN, World Bank, and other institutions. It defines the overall threat to peace in a given country as a combination of specific individual threats identified by the European Union in its global strategy. The second goal of the Normandie Index is therefore to provide a tool for EU policymakers to assess countries most at risk in the world and target EU action. It is based on the approach of the European Union as an international actor. The findings of the Normandie Index should be therefore compared to our own expectations of what we want to achieve with the EU's foreign and security policy. Furthermore, recent opinion polls show that our citizens expect more EU action on the global stage, including as a stronger actor for peace and security. The European Parliament has, after the Lisbon Treaty, a more important voice in EU's foreign policy. Analytic tools like the Normandie Index can be highly relevant for our legislative work, for oversight, and for parliamentary diplomacy. Evidence-based reports, data, and facts are critical to our decision-making. Having the right researched and uncorrupted data is essential in an age of deliberate and targeted disinformation and information warfare. The exertion of foreign influence through the spread of disinformation and the fake news is now threatening democratic processes in our member states and our allies. In foreign policy, particularly in the promotion of peace and security, getting our agenda right means identifying our goals through doctrine and strategies such as the global strategy for the EU. But it also means allocating the necessary resources and deploying the right tools in the right places, be they civilian or military. This is where data, qualitative and quantitative, becomes essential for both drafting and implementing our policies. At the European Parliament, our focus is both thematic and geographic through our delegations, so this kind of work is highly useful on both these levels. At this point, I would like to indicate to you the second study entitled Peace and Security in 2019 by EPRS, our in-house research service. The study addresses in depth the various policies that contribute to the EU's actions on peace and security, shaping the debate on peace in a scientific manner. The analysis shapes also the information in a policy-oriented way, since it refers to the institutional structure and, quite importantly, the budgetary aspects that go into the implementation of these policies. It is relevant to remember that the EU's tools for the promotion of peace and security are mainly non-military. The study presents in detail the core policies of development cooperation, economic, financial, and technical cooperation, humanitarian aid, trade, enlargement, and democracy support. At the same time, more progress has been achieved for the EU security and defense in the last 2 years than in the entire history of European integration. The study highlights correctly the efforts to build a more autonomous and efficient CSDP through initiatives such as PESCO and the European Defence Fund. As other major international players tend to replace multilateralism with unilateralism, which means in its turn replacing cooperation with competition, the EU's international action focuses on the support and contribution to multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and others. Through our Memorandum of Understanding with the region of Normandy, EPRS has contributed to the forum annually by producing this publication and a second publication with a regional focus. Last year, the focus was on the Western Balkans, a region which has been in the spotlight in recent months due to the successful and peaceful resolution of the dispute over North Macedonia's name, allowing the country to move close to its ambition to join both NATO and the EU. A diplomatic success which also testifies to the soft power of the EU. This year, the regional focus is on Colombia, a country where, in spite of geographical distance, the EU has mobilized its entire panoply of civilian instruments: bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, humanitarian and development aid, and trade relations. Since the signature of the 2016 peace agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC, the EU has redoubled its commitment through a substantial aid package. And already in 2015, the EU appointed Mr. Eamon Gilmore as special envoy to the Colombian peace process. I invite you to read both these studies. Our world today is more connected, more contested, and as a result, more complex than ever. The nature of threats to security today is more hybrid than ever before. Population displacements that can cause big risk to human security can emanate from natural disasters or water shortages as much as they do from armed conflict. Wars carried out through fiber optic cables can have devastating effects on the prosperity of large populations, not to mention that they can corrupt people's minds and subsequently the practices of free thinking and democracy. Those complex and interlinked threats call for complex solutions. As the EU aspires to be an even stronger global player, the responsibility for finding solutions for region and the countries across the world is also greater. To design such strategies and policies, we policymakers need to work closely with experts, both social scientists and increasingly with those from the so-called hard sciences, as technology becomes part and parcel of every single policy we legislate on. I look forward to engaging with experts, policymakers, and not least the civil society represented here today to take the work forward. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow we will solemnly mark the 70th anniversary of the D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. We pay homage to the veterans and to all those who made the ultimate sacrifice for peace in Europe and the world. A century ago, in June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War. Politicians of the time wanted it to be the war to end all wars, and that idea led to the creation of the League of Nations. The timing and location of the Normandie World Forum for Peace are therefore most appropriate. I commend the organizers for bringing together policymakers and academics, experts and representatives of civil society to debate solutions for long-lasting peace. As we honor the memory of the victims of wars, we need to remember that achieving peace is never to be taken for granted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vice President, for presenting the action of the European Union for peace in the world, and doing so, insisting on the conception that peace is not about avoiding conflicts only, but it's also looking at the wider picture and taking into account threats such as cybersecurity, such as fragile states, such as climate change, and many others. And this is actually this kind of basket of threats is what drives the global strategy of the European Union in the world. And the same threats have been the basis for the work that has been conducted with the Institute for Economics and Peace for establishing this index. And I'm very happy now to hand over to Steve Killier from the Institute for Economics and Peace, who was been preparing the different elements of this index, and that has been this is now ready for presentation. Thank you.
So I think I'd just start by talking a little bit about the uniqueness of the index. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, we produce three major indexes: Terrorism Index, Global Peace Index, and Positive Peace Index. Now, all of them are looking at different states of peace today. And I think what's unique about the Normandie Index, it actually starts to look at a holistic range of possible threats to peace, which then gives an ability to be able to adjust policy to look forward for future actions. Now, if we're looking at threats, in many ways they're relative to a whole range of other things. So one is history, like is a threat more of a threat than it was last year or less than it was last year? And so this is the inaugural cut of the Normandie Index, and as we get more cuts of it going forward in the future, we'll be able to now track threats over time to determine, are they getting worse or were they actually improving? And the other thing I think about it, you can always compare a threat to the global average. That way it gives you a relative way of being able to understand the positioning of a nation. And I think one of the strengths of this index is the ability to be able to look at what you could call hybrid threats. In other words, where a country has multiple threats which could occur in the foreseeable future. So if we look at the index, this is a quick map of the world. And so if you look at it, the dark red is the areas which have got the most threat, and the lightest colours are the ones with the least threat. So you'll notice that the major threats are associated in two different areas of the world. So first is the sub-Saharan Africa, and the second is South Asia. And you'll note that North Canada, Australia, and particularly Western and Eastern Europe are the ones with the areas with the least threat when we look going forward. Now, if we look at this, it gives an idea of the countries which are ranked at the top of the index. So you'll find Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the EU. Now, these countries you'd normally see sitting at the top of an index, but because we're looking at it from a threat, you're now seeing countries which normally you wouldn't see, such as Mongolia, Argentina, or Uruguay. And so if you're looking at a peace index, you'd find each of those countries would be ranking maybe around the middle of the index. If you're looking at the positive peace attributes, you'd probably find them ranking there. So the threats to these countries are probably not large. If we now go and look at the bottom 10 on the Normandie Index, you'll find many of the countries which you're most familiar with are sitting there. And so a lot of them are engaged in conflict, or have just come out of conflict, countries such as Iraq. Sudan, we can see that what's going on in there at the moment with the demonstrations and the killings just even overnight. And Syria, Pakistan and Somalia, Afghanistan, Southern Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, all are labelled with the conflict issues. But if we moved out of the bottom 10 and moved into, let's say, the bottom 20, you'd find countries like China, India and Turkey, which are also ranked down in those areas. So they're countries which have probably got more risk than what would naturally come to our minds. Now, just on this slide before we move on, this is just the EU and how it compares. And so we use these spider diagrams for the way we've laid out all the countries in the index to be able to analyse how do they stand compared to the global average. So when you're looking at this, what you'll see is the blue line is the EU, and when we look at the red line, that's the global average. So now, where the blue line is inside the global average, that means then there's more of a threat than what you'd find with the global average. So if we look at this from the EU's perspective, there's only one area where it's actually got more of a threat than the global average, and that is in the area of energy and security. And that's mainly because it's dependent on oil from the Middle East and gas from Russia and the Eastern Europe. So I'll stop at this point now, and then I'll come back to more on the index in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Steve. Now I'm going to turn to Vice President Pașcu again. Vice President, you have been Vice President also of the Committee on Foreign Affairs for a long time. You have been Defense Minister. How would you say, are we living in a world that is more dangerous now? What are the threats and the challenges that we have to face as the European Union?
Well, it's true that Europe is more peaceful than other areas in the world. But at the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that we are to undergo a profound change in the nature of the international system. So up until now, we had the institutional multilateralism, which required, in order to be working, cooperation, especially between the major actors. Now we move into an area in which practically unilateralism becomes the norm. And once unilateralism becomes the norm, cooperation tends to be replaced, by competition. And we already see the competition among the great powers. And if we take, for instance, the relationship between the United States and China, we see that this relationship tends to become dominant in our international system, with all the consequences for everyone. I read, this change from institutional multilateralism to unilateralism as a sort of a feeling on the part of the great powers that they want more freedom of action. The world is changing rapidly, it's changing profoundly. The tectonic plates are shifting, technology is advancing very rapidly, and this is changing the world too rapidly for the major actors to adapt themselves to this, to keep pace with this change. So therefore they would like, to have more freedom of action. And therefore, they want to really stress unilateralism. And I believe, that this is a profound change which will have consequences, various consequences for everyone. At the same time, these changes, produce these conflicts around us. I can compare this, for instance, with the activity of the volcanoes, which is intensifying when we have, big movements under the surface of the world. So therefore, we are in such a period. This is how I read, unfortunately, this situation. I wished we could read something better and nicer, but I'm afraid that we have to face this reality.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pașcu. Turning back to you now, Steve, I would like to ask you, based on the index and the findings, if there are any regions we should put our focus on, if the European Union should engage more particularly on certain regions. You mentioned already the top 10 and let's say the 10 that are at the down 10, if I may say so, but on which regions should we focus based on your assessment?
So I think the first thing to look at is how to do an assessment. So the thing to do is focus on the countries or the regions which have got the most hybrid threats, and then also the ones which have got most at risk on any single indicator, and then obviously according to the priorities which the EU sees fit. So if we start to look at this map here, this looks at cyber security, and what we do here is we look at the legislations which are in place in countries to determine the level of protection they got from a threat of cyber security. So North America comes out on top in this. You can see that Africa and again South Asia are the ones which are worst, and then you'll find that Europe has got fairly adequate protections as well. If we flip over to, let's say, economic crises. Now, I'm not going to go through the full 11 indicators here. I'll just go through 5 because we're limited on time, just so we've got a feel for the way the index is constructed. So in terms of determining whether there's an emerging economic crisis, we look at the percentage of non-performing loans within a country. You'll notice that North America, on that angle, is the most stable. Asia Pacific, followed by North America, followed by Asia Pacific. Now, if we look at the ones which are the worst, what we find is you're over at Russia and Sub-Saharan Africa. If we come and look at energy and security, again we come back here, and this is the area where the EU performs the worst, and that's because of the level of oil and gas imports. Mexico's the other one which comes up, which has got fairly high levels of energy insecurity, although with the US now being a net exporter of oil and gas, they've probably got reasonable security from there. If we come back and look at the fragility, when we come back and look at fragility and we look at the scores here, what we find is that the most fragile areas are in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and the Middle East. North America and EU 28 and Europe and Asia-Pac are the ones which have got the strongest or the least unstable regions in the world. We come around and look at the homicide rates, which is another measure. This is particularly pertinent for risks in Latin America, which have got the highest homicide rates in the world and have been increasing. All in all, homicide rates have been dropping globally, but in Latin America they've been climbing. So from this again we can see that Europe is rated very, very highly. Now, I'm just going to very quickly cover 3 case studies just so you can get a feel for how you could use the indexes. And again, we're back to these spider diagrams. And so if we look at the red line, that's the global average. And so what you're looking for is where a country compared to its, and what we do here is look at the regional averages to compare how they compare to the region. So where the blue line is moving towards the centre and inside the red line, that's where you've got more risk. So we look at Georgia, it comes back and it scores very, very well on the economic crises, cyber security and democratic processes. But the area where it's most weak is in terms of its energy stability. So that's a fairly good score. That looks fairly good. So let's have a look at another one now. And so if we look at Colombia, we see quite a different picture here. So we see many of the blue line inside the red line on many different areas here, such as climate change, the level of homicides, the freedom of the press, the level of terrorism in the country, and also the level of violent conflict. So obviously this is a country which you prioritise. Now, Ethiopia would be another one, which is well worthwhile having a look at as well. And so if we look at this is a very different comparison to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So for energy, it's okay, but if we start to look at the levels of terrorism, the likelihood of violent conflict, the level of democratic processes, we find it's well below the regional average. So this would be the areas where you could now start to look at how do you actually implement and affect policy.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this presentation. Then, from research back to politics, I turn to you again, Mr. Pașcu. If we look back the 10 years from now, what would you say are the main achievements of the European Union in terms of peace? And if you consider there are things we could do better or gaps for the future, based also on this work, what would you suggest then?
Well, thank you. Well, I think you know that the main contribution of Europe to peace, to world peace, is that we have been a continent which practically started 2 world wars, and we are not any longer a continent which can generate wars. So this is the main thing which we did, and which needs to be preserved. The second thing is that the EU is the biggest provider of humanitarian aid in the world, and it is using a wide number of instruments. So what we have done lately, we started to emphasize also the military aspects, the military components. And here, you know, we are working in two areas. The first area, which is relatively new, is that common money coming from the European Commission are used, you know, in order to encourage research and also to encourage the devising the capabilities, and this is encouraging, shall we say, the grassroots cooperation between the defense producers in Europe. But when it comes to the existing capabilities, this is certainly left, you know, to the states, and the states are doing it through PESCO projects. PESCO has been practically a clause in the Lisbon Treaty which has not been activated until recently, and it has been activated with a great success. We have 25 members who are really participating in this project, a number of 2 rounds of projects, about 34 projects in this respect. I would also like to point out to the fact that military mobility has become one of the, shall we say, most successful areas of cooperation between EU and NATO. So I think, you know, that we respond to the request of the citizens that we should do more for security and defense. And this, I expect, you know, that this will continue in the future. The Parliament is very active. The Parliament has always asked the Commission to produce a white book on defense, which would really give even more focus and coherence to the efforts in this respect. I hope that this will happen one day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pașcu. Now, again, about the future from the research perspective to you, Steve. One talk a lot about disinformation and new threats coming and hybrid threats and the question of threats getting more complex and so on. What's your view on this?
Well, I think we're definitely living in a world where where the threats are getting more complex. And so I think there's a need to keep updating the index on a yearly basis and to look at new and emerging threats and to bring them in. So if we look at the 11 priority areas, as in the EU strategy paper for 2018, cross-border crime and hybrid warfare were two which we couldn't measure this time. But when we look at the routes which criminals use, they're fairly well known and can also, through expert assessment, start to assess the level of organised crime in different countries. And that'll be a way of being able to actually come and be able to measure cross-border crime. Hybrid warfare is a lot more difficult. We haven't really been able to crack that nut as yet. But what's important with indexes, such as this one, is to maintain the specificness of it so that it's actually focused on the key issue which it's trying to solve. But it needs to evolve over time. And to do this, there'll be evolving issues and threats which are going to come. One of the things which I think is under-emphasised today is a lot of the threats to the ecology, and as human activity becomes more and more prevalent over the planet, the ecology is suffering in many ways, whether it's the ocean, whether it's the fresh water, whether it's biodiversity. So these threats will come in the future. I think one of the other things which needs to be thought through this, and this is a complex subject and too much for this session, is just the concept of applying systems thinking to the way states and threats evolve. And so one of the points out of systems thinking is tipping points. So you can do something for many, 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 many years without it having too much impact. And then once you pass a point, just small amounts more will cause things to fall off cliffs. And so that can be seen with the ecology, could be seen with the climate, but you can also see it in things like, let's say, corruption and peace. So just as a very concrete example, you can increase corruption and it has very little effect on peace, up to a point. Then very small increases in corruption, you have peace just falls off a cliff. So I think sort of this kind of involving systems thinking into indexes and the evolution of them, trying to track new and emerging threats and bring them in, I think will be key. And so these things do need to be updated year by year.
Thank you very much, Steve. On your side, Mr. Pașcu, how do you see the use of such an index for the policymakers and for the politicians or for the wider public debate?
Well, thank you. You know, there is a saying that politics is also an art, the art of compromise, for instance. But at the same time, you know, the decisions in politics have to reflect realities which have to be, shall we say, closer to what really we find on the ground. And therefore, you know, we use these sort of instruments, or are supposed to use these instruments, in order to give us the real configuration of the reality in which we will have to intervene with our own decisions. Of course, the decision makers will always be supported and fascinated by the intelligence provided by the services in this respect. But at the same time, I think, you know, that increasingly they will have to look to such instruments which gives an image which is focused and centralized. It can tell you a lot from, you know, where such a country is in the index. And therefore, you know, I think that this is going to be increasingly relevant for the decision makers. But at the same time, let's not forget that we also, as academics, we have to convince the decision makers to use these instruments. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, vice-président. Merci beaucoup, Steve. Nous arrivons à la fin de cette session. Je voulais vous remercier. Je crois que c'était un dialogue extrêmement intéressant qui prend plus de temps que prévu, donc merci à vous. Je pense que ce sera en effet un outil utile pour les parlementaires, pour les décideurs politiques, mais aussi pour le public plus large. Ça, c'est un premier point. Ce sur quoi je voudrais aussi insister, c'est que quand on dit indice, on pense chiffres, on pense classement. Et que la discussion de ce soir nous montre à quel point il est important de regarder ce qui est derrière, d'aller au plus profond possible. Et je vous invite à cet égard, et je vais faire un peu de publicité, à lire les études qui ont été distribuées ou qui sont disponibles sur Internet. Je voudrais aussi remercier les collègues ici présents dans la salle, Monica Noga, Isabelle Ioannidis, Eleni Lazarou, Philippe Perchoc, qui ont travaillé d'arrache-pied pour ce travail, et aussi Franck Debier, qui a été l'instrument de la Convention pour la coopération avec la région Normandie. Et je pense aussi à mes collègues à Bruxelles qui ne sont pas ici, qui ont travaillé sur ce projet. Merci à tous et bonne continuation.
Merci pour cette première édition de l'indice Normandie du Parlement européen.
Alors, comme ça vient d'être dit durant cette table ronde, le projet européen est parti du désastre de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Et
allemande, comme quoi il y a une vraie capacité de réconciliation malgré les terribles épreuves de la guerre.